Hi, I'm Chris Hartley, the author of The Lost Soldier, and this is Author's Voice.
Welcome to Author's Voice, connecting authors to the world. You are watching Stranger Than Fiction, and I am your host, Bjorn Skaptason. Thank you for coming back to Author's Voice. Thank you for coming back to Author's Voice in 2019. We're beginning our third or fourth season of Author's Voice programs, depending on how you count it. But we've been doing Author's Voice for a long time now. We're starting to get good at it. We've been doing live stream book events for 10 years. Our guest today has already been on one of those before. We used to call it virtual book signing. But today we are talking about The Lost Soldier, the ordeal of a World War II GI from the home front to the Hurtgen forest. It's published by Stackpole Books, and the cost is $29.95. We thank Stackpole Books for publishing it and helping Chris get here. And our guest is Chris J. Hartley. Welcome to Author's Voice.
Thanks, Bjorn. Great to be here. Real honor to kick off 2019
2019, as you were just saying, your favorite month of the year for Chicago.
At least one of the 12.
One of your 12 favorite months in Chicago. Yes, January in Chicago. What a great time to come from North Carolina to Chicago.
Absolutely. Chicago's always beautiful, though.
It is. Thank you for coming back.
Thank you
so much. And, okay, folks at home, if you're watching on the Facebook Live feed, by all means, please ask us questions. I have questions for Chris, but I would just as soon have you ask all the questions. So if you're watching on Facebook Live, ask your questions in the comments section. And I have Facebook open here. I can see it and I'll answer your questions. If you're watching on authorsvoice.net, if you're watching on our website, you can also ask questions. Just down below, there's a form there, and you can ask questions and type it in and send it. Again, I'll see it, and we can answer your questions. And then the most important thing, again, is you must order the book. I'm commanding you to order this book. Get a signed copy, and because you're about to find out why The Lost Soldier is a special World War II book. There's a lot of World War II books, but you're about to find out why this is a special project that succeeds on so many levels. And we're going to get right into that right now. Chris Hartley, welcome to Author's Voice. For you folks at home, Chris is an author of quite a few Civil War books, including one on Stoneman's Raid and Stuart's Tar Heels, and a lot of other Civil War stuff. Lives in North Carolina.
Correct.
But now you've picked up a World War II topic. Tell us about why you wanted to write The Lost Soldier.
Absolutely. This Bjorn was a book I had to write. It is a story that came to me in 1984 when I was dating my wife for the first time, the lady who became my wife, and was on a family trip to her grandmother's house down in North Carolina. And she heard I was interested in historical things. And so at that point, she got up and took me to her closet in her little house down there in Kings Mountain, right outside of Charlotte, and pulled out an old Army duffel bag, and it was filled with old letters and a diary and official documents that and photographs, and that were just powerful as I started to look through them. And I just knew that was, after that brief look at those materials, I had to come back and spend more time with them. And I did, and found that there was a great story in there, the story of the Lost Soldier.
So this is, to some extent, a family story, and but as we were talking about before the program started, you didn't write a family history. You wrote a straight up, it's a biography, it's a history, it's a social history of a certain time and a certain place and a certain family and the communities they come from. So how did you, what kind of challenges did you find translating your family story into biography and history? Because these are different types of stories, aren't they?
Yeah, it is. But what really occurred to me as I was putting this book together is that the story of this soldier and his wife and his family Pete Lynn was his name. He was 33 years old when he was drafted into the U.S. Army in 1944. His story was so much like the story of so many others who have gone through that experience, who are drafted, whose lives change forever overnight. He's drafted in March of 1944. He's sent off to Europe to serve in the 20th Infantry Division. He doesn't come home. He makes the ultimate sacrifice. And veterans will tell you that the heroes are those who make the ultimate sacrifice. The heroes are really those who don't come home. Pete Lynn made that sacrifice. His wife made that sacrifice. And his story really is representative of so many soldiers who have been there and done that. Whether you're from North Carolina or Georgia or Alaska or wherever you might be from, it's the story of every soldier who has been there and done that on behalf of freedom in our country.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And there's so much more. Again, this book, not just this story, but this book, there's so much more to this book than that narrow story. And we might get to this, we'll probably get to this a little bit later, but you know, poor Pete's experience in the European campaign was not long.
It was brief.
It was brief and tragic, and like so many others. Because again, you'll talk to the veterans, and they'll say, you know, so many people that got it right away.
Very quickly.
Weren't even there long enough to figure out how to survive.
Absolutely.
And we can talk a little bit more about the details of the Hurtgen Forest fight and all that. That's something I want to cover with you. But first, I want a little more of how you approach the project.
Yeah.
Now, I think the folks that like to look at our shows, or at least the folks that like to look at our House Divided Civil War show, the people that have read your other books, they're pretty familiar with the primary sources of Civil War history and how you probably went together putting together Stoneman's Raid and Stewart's Artillery. You this much time in the OR, this much time at Duke or one of these other great repositories.
Right.
These aren't the same places you go to write a World War II
Correct.
book. So what did you have to learn picking up this project from the beginning as a Civil War historian, picking this up from the beginning? What new things did you have to learn about the primary source material? Where did you have to go to answer these questions?
Yeah, a lot of really fun places.
Okay.
To answer that story, you know, it starts with it's what is the world that they live in like, and for this young couple, it was about being in a mill town in the South in the pre-war days, and so it's part of that is learning about what it was like to be in a mill village, which was a very repetitive and you know, poor way of life in many ways. And so the sources are all about being in a mill village. The sources are family members. The sources are the people who lived in that mill village at the time. I was helped by a delightful gentleman who has since passed on, who was in the mill village when Pete Lynn was there and knew him and described to me what it was like in those days. You know, you continue on. Certainly the diaries and letters that were left behind by the family were very important.
So what came out of the duffel bag?
Absolutely. That was a huge part of the story because they tell you step by step what happened to Pete and what happened to his wife Ruth throughout the tenure of his trip to Camp Fannin, the replacement training center where he basically went through basic training in Texas, and then on to the ultimate trip over to Europe. But you know, when he goes over to Europe, then things stop because of censorship rules. He's not allowed to give a lot of detail about what's going on in his life or what's going on with military maneuvers. So at that point, you have to turn to the official records. And that is the National Archives in Maryland that houses a vast majority of the records that were collected by the U.S. military during World War II. There are after-action reports. There are documents. There are official reports. There are you know, morning reports that are kept in St. Louis. It's all this detail that you have to go through down to the company level to really understand what was happening to the men on the ground. And there's a lot of piecing together that takes place, but it's a fabulous journey into the daily activities of these men. And so through those lenses, both diaries, letters, personal recollections, family members, and the official record, this story was able to come together.
Right, and so the folks at home, you need to know that this isn't one of those stories where Pete gets drafted, then he goes through basic training, okay, let's go to Europe.
Yeah.
Because you went and you found out about Camp Fannin. So we learned about Camp Fannin. We learned about how transportation from one place to another. So you must have looked at the transportation records.
Definitely.
And all that kind of thing. How they trained. Actually, I was surprised that the replacements got such good training.
Absolutely.
When in fact, even though it still didn't work out for many of them
Correct.
by the time they got to the front, but the Army really gave these guys, in a short amount of time, a pretty thorough training program.
They really did. In fact, one of the reasons that Pete Lynn, at 33 years old, and a father with 2 kids at home and a third on the way, one of the reasons that Pete was actually sent to the front was because the U.S. Army decided to expand the length of basic training during the war. Those additional weeks put a stress on the number of men available at the front, and as a result, they had to dig deeper into the manpower barrel. So whereas early in the war, you had a reluctance to call fathers into the military service, by that point in the war, because of casualties and changes to training, you had to go to the fathers. And so that's why somebody like Pete Lynn at 33 is off to the war.
Let me get a little more information about his hometown, because there's a chapter on that really fleshes out Kings Mountain, North Carolina, and fleshes out the textile industry. You didn't just work at a textile mill. You tell us what it's like to work at Margate on one side, and
Margrace Mill,
Margrace Mill,
and Park
and then on
Yarn
the other
Mill.
side, and everybody in Kings Mountain is they're mill towns, and they live. They lived to work at these mills.
They absolutely did, and they came up in the mill life, beginning for Pete when he was about 12 years old. He goes to work in the mill in the 1930s. This Depression era time, but there was a saying in the Depression that if you had a job, the Depression wasn't so bad. Being in the textile industry, textiles kept humming throughout the 1930s, and so these folks in Kings Mountain had a job. It was a difficult job. It was in many ways a dangerous job. It was a repetitive job. You do the same thing over and over and over again. Pete Lynn was a card hand, and so he worked in the card room, which is filled with equipment and pulleys and sharp teeth that are pulling at cotton and trying to prepare it for further processing. It's a loud place. It's a place with cotton dust in the air. Cotton gets in your nose, it gets in your eyes, your ears, it's all over your body. It's no wonder they called them limp heads because of working in cotton mills. But ultimately, it was not the most lucrative way of life, but they made it work. Pete and Ruth loved each other. They were happy in this life. They were surrounded by friends. They were surrounded by family. They did everything in the mill village. They shopped. They went to church. They went to school. Their kids grew up there. Pete and Ruth met each other in the mill village. It was all they knew.
They had a little dream. Didn't they have a little dream about maybe getting a shop somewhere?
They wanted a house with the traditional picket fence.
Yeah,
right?
yeah.
The white picket fence, and which, by the way, Ruth would actually get that after the war, partly because of the insurance proceeds from Pete's policy.
From the life insurance policy.
Yep.
How important was it for you to visit these places?
There's
right
no,
now I'm talking about North Carolina. Later it'll be Europe. But
right.
You did go. But how important was it to visit these places?
There's no substitute for seeing and being where these people were. Whether it's no matter who you're writing about or what you're writing about, you have to be on the ground. You have to see it with your own eyes to understand it better. Rick Atkinson, a great author, many of your viewers I'm sure know his work, has always said that the job of an author, a nonfiction author, is to bring the dead to life in many ways. But to do that, you've got to understand what it was like. What did it look like? What did people feel? What did they see every day? And to put yourself in that environment and try to put that, bring that to life for the reader is what really makes a powerful book and something people I think will appreciate reading.
Yeah, and this is a great book because you're gonna not just because you're gonna find out about the war, you're gonna find out about Kings Mountain, North Carolina, and the textile industry. Now we talked about this comparison before the show, and I look at this and I'm reminded of Thomas Childer's Wings of Morning. You mentioned that you hadn't read Wings of Morning, so this is not based on that in any way at all. But that also, to me, that's important because Wings of Morning and this and other maybe any other like books are important because they explore the story of the soldier and the process of the family recovering the story of the soldier.
Yes.
So you didn't read Wings of Morning, but Childers talks about how he learned about his ancestor, his uncle, and so on. And while you do not insert yourself into the story, you can see the process of recovering just one generation's worth of stories. And I think that is a quality of some of the books that are coming out from this generation of writers thinking about World War II. This ought to have led to a question, but really it's just...
But I certainly will give a comment about it.
Yeah. I mean, to me, it seems like you're writing in an emerging genre. I think other people are seeing stories like this.
Yeah, I certainly agree with that, because there's so much that can be learned and said about what every member of this story went through. You know, it's not about just one person in his life, but it's about all those people around him and what every day was like. You know, the story of Ruth and her kids back home and what they're enduring while Pete is gone overseas. It's such a hard thing to read, but it's so real for those who have been through it before. You know, the day when Ruth and her two kids are walking back from a Sunday school gathering one night across the mill village, the darkened mill factory is silent on this weekend night. They're coming back from a fried chicken social with their church, and the young daughter, one of the young daughters, my wife's mother, by the way, looks up at her mother and says, "Mom, I wish the old army would be over." You know, it's just a powerful moment that tells you, wow, this is really has a long and far reach that, by the way, continues to this day.
Yeah.
It's not just then. World War II continues to this day.
Now, let's go ahead and talk a little bit about Pete's experience in the war, because he ends up being put right into the one of the real high-profile meat grinders of World War II. So he goes over, as you say, he's in the 28th Division, gets assigned to the 28th Division, but he's not originally part of it. He's a replacement.
Correct.
And you tell a lot about what it's like to be a replacement. So give the folks at home a little idea of what Pete's experience was of, showing up and being a replacement.
Yeah, so there are many philosophies in the military on how you can take care of casualties in a unit. So you can either, if you have casualties in a unit, you can either take that unit out of the line and reconstitute it out of the line, or you can just replace men one by one as they're wounded or killed. It's an efficient way to keep a line staffed with the same divisions, but it's very difficult on somebody who shows up in the back of a truck one dark night in Europe and gets thrust into the line without knowing the person on their right or on their left, not having ever spent a day at the front in combat, and having to learn the ropes basically while you're being shot at. It's a very, very intimidating process from A to Z, because you're by yourself from the moment you land in Europe all the way to the front line. You're hearing artillery off in the distance thundering. Wags are asking you for your wife's phone number and telling you that only 1 in 3 of you replacements is really going to make it.
Right.
What an intimidating thing to go through. That was the story of the replacements, and it gained a lot of criticism during the war from Pete's own division commander all the way up the line.
And and it's an unusual and stern rebuke to this myth, if you want to call it, that it's all a band of brothers. They might start out as a band of brothers, but after a few months, they're a band of strangers.
Exactly.
Still trying to do the same job.
Yeah.
And it can be very hard on those replacements.
These quote unquote strangers, replacements that come into the line, are often not embraced by their fellow soldiers, because the fear is they're going to be dead within hours, if not minutes once they arrive. So it's something that really hurts a unit's effectiveness to have a number of men in a unit that really aren't known entities, and to look to them to contribute to an action, whatever it may be, is a stretch.
But he's assigned to a famous division. So there
Absolutely.
he is, the 28th. He gets into the 28th Division, 112th Infantry.
112th Infantry Regiment, the Bloody Bucket, as the Germans called it.
Yeah.
Famous during the hedgerows of Normandy. The Germans said that the division fought so hard that they called them the Bloody Bucket after the shape of their division patch.
If anybody at home can imagine the old newsreel footage of the American division marching down the Champs-Élysées,
Yes.
Champs-Élysées, and under the Arc de Triomphe, those are the Bloody Buckets, right?
That is the Bloody Bucket, and they marched straight out of Paris and right back into the front line.
Yeah.
Right after that that picture was taken, and Pete joined that very unit just a few weeks later.
And so, yeah, this brings us to this controversial battle, and it's a battle in which Pete lost his life. You had a chance to end up over in Europe writing about this Hurtgen Forest battle, the 28th Division Hurtgen Forest battle. Tell the folks at home a little bit about that.
Yeah, the Hurtgen Forest was not the U.S. Army's shining moment during the European conflict. It was sandwiched right in between the advance from Normandy throughout the pursuit across France. It was prior to the Battle of the Bulge, but it was this time period when the U.S. Army was attempting to get out of France and get to the Rhine River. In order to do that, they had a designed program, Eisenhower and his generals, to launch an attack through the Stolberg corridor, which was an open plain, which was better for the maneuver of armor. But the Hurtgen Forest was right next to this forested area, that the fear of the U.S. Army was that forces would attack and counterattack into the flank of any attack through the Stolberg corridor. As a result, the military felt like they had to send troops into the Hurtgen Forest to protect the flank of this advance toward the Rhine River. That was the job of the soldiers who went into the Hurtgen Forest, but it was a very difficult job. The terrain could not have been worse. If you even visit that forest today, it has this Hansel and Gretel quality to it. It's a very almost haunted feeling forest. And it was cold, and it was full of prepared German defenses. Lots of concrete that you can still see to this day. Just a very hilly terrain, rivers to cross, hills to cover, and very vigorously defended by the Germans, who, by the way, were at the time trying to keep prying American eyes away from preparations to launch what became the Battle of the Bulge.
We have a question
Yes.
from Mike Peters in Columbus. Thank you very much, Columbus. And Mike wants to know how much of the 28th Division history pre-1944 is included in your work.
Yeah, great question, Mike, and hello to you. That is, I do cover the history of the division to some degree, so of course it is one of the oldest divisions in the U.S. Army. Benjamin Franklin is said to be one of its founders, all the way back to Philadelphia days. It was a Pennsylvania National Guard unit when World War II broke out. It, of course, had a history during World War I, fought in the Argonne during that terrible conflict. And I trace a little bit of its history from Normandy into France and into Germany. There's a story that's told that the division that lands after D-Day and advances into the hedgerows receives so many casualties, including 2 division commanders before Norman Cota becomes the commander, that a man shows up and is in the hedgerows or past the hedgerows and says, well, where's all the Pennsylvanias? And the answer came that we left them back in the hedgerows because of all the casualties they suffered. Excellent division, but one that had its challenges because it goes from the Hurtgen Forest, where it suffered 6,000 and some odd casualties, and goes on to a quiet place where it was attacked in the Battle of the Bulge in the Ardennes. Absolutely.
Mike has a follow-up for you, Chris. And then how many veterans from Pete's unit were you able to contact?
So I did talk to some veterans of Pete's unit. In fact, one of the challenges, though, is the fact that the individual unit that he was a member of was essentially decimated. The 112th Regiment that Pete served in probably suffered more casualties than any other of the 28th Infantry Division, but I was able to get in contact with a couple of other members of the 28th Infantry Division from Pennsylvania who shared with me some of their experiences during the battle, and just powerful to hear their stories and what it really meant to them to go through the Hurtgen Forest. It was one of the worst places that anybody could have served during the war.
Mm-hmm. And then Pete's experience there was pretty short.
It was short. The 28th Division launched its attack on November 2nd, 1944. It was the only attack that took place along the entire Western Front of Europe that day. His attack launched about noon that day of November 2nd in a very cold and misty day, not like what we unlike what we have in Chicago today.
Yeah.
Very much like that. Even a little bit of ice in the air that day. Pete's attack began at noon. He was missing in action within 2 hours after that attack because they were basically attacked or ran into a German defensive position. He was cut off, being at the head of his attacking column.
Now, and the folks will need to read the book to get that story of the battle. And Chris does a great job of telling the military story of the Hurtgen Forest battle. But again, I want to get to the importance of visiting a battlefield. So you went overseas.
Yes.
You visited these places. What's it like to walk
I did.
in that area now?
Yeah, in my opinion, the battlefield of the Hurtgen Forest is one of those places you can go to in Europe and get a real sense on what it was like that day in 1944 for those soldiers. The terrain, the villages, of course, have been rebuilt. The roads, of course, are paved, but there's still many trenches in evidence. There's still a lot of concrete in place. They're still finding bodies to this day of men who were lost in the midst of that battle. And the terrain itself speaks volumes. You can stand there where Pete and his fellow soldiers stood right outside of the village of Wassenack there in Germany, and see the ridge line that German artillery was posted on, and you can understand what a difficult challenge they had. It's also a place where you can go and see a monument to a German division, which is something that, of course, you don't see for obvious reasons in France and Belgium, but you go into Germany and there's a monument to the 116th Panzer Division. Very telling and very powerful. Overlooking where Pete himself lost his life.
Right. Now then the next chapter here, and we're getting close to the end of our time, but I do not want to pass over this crucial chapter in that, because I also think it's typical of other stories I've seen, is that Pete isn't killed in action. Pete is missing in action. And what does that mean for Ruth?
That's correct.
When that telegram comes, but it doesn't say exactly what you expected to say.
Yeah, Pete is missing in action after that battle on November 2nd. Ruth gets a telegram back in Kings Mountain, very rude way to find out. Opens it up, reads the cold message from the U.S. military that says your husband is missing in action as of November 2nd, 1944. And Ruth writes in her diary that night 3 words that are, to me, the most powerful words in this entire book. She writes, "Bottom fell out." And what a tragic feeling that she must have put on those pages when she wrote those 3 words. It's so descriptive of what happened. The bottom fell out of her life. It's so descriptive of what happened for the men in the Hurtgen Forest. The bottom fell out of anything they knew. And Ruth had to deal with that going forward, not knowing where her husband was. She did everything she could to find him. Of course, she was in tremendous grief. But ultimately, she would get the news that the last thing she didn't want to hear, that he had been killed in action. But she would not hear that until the following March of 1945. So for several months, she had no idea where her husband was. She could only hope and pray.
But like so many other families, and I think this was in, I think if I recall from Wings of Mourning from Childers, the families just can't sit and wait.
Yeah.
So they're desperately trying to do everything, and you find all sorts of letters that Ruth wrote, trying to write to the division commander. Has anybody heard from him? Even though the battle is still on?
Desperately trying. She gets on the telephone. She calls people she knew who might know something. She talks to soldiers who were coming back home at this time, having served their career. She, as you mentioned, she writes men she'd heard of in her company, in Pete's company. She writes the leaders of the brigade or the regiment and on up the line. she does everything she can. She even joins her friends in a Ouija board session one day. You know, bless her heart, she was a pistol of a woman. I knew her well, and she just did not give up.
Mm-hmm.
She loved that man.
Mm-hmm. And then this brings us into the final. You and I talked about this again before we started. That brings us into the final process.
Mm-hmm.
And indeed, Pete lived at a time when fighting a war was a process.
Mm-hmm.
It's not the Civil War where
Right.
it's a different experience. The World War II is a meat grinder, and it's an industrial process from the time Pete got the telegram until the time that Ruth got Pete's effects. And so we can't go very long with this, but yeah, give folks at home an idea of what this massive process was of finally getting a soldier home.
Yeah, what a process it was. You're so
And it
right.
does mean that
Yeah.
it's a process, but it shows that we care.
Yeah. Yeah, very much so. I mean, his effects were, of course, removed once his body was found by U.S. forces, were removed and sent to a facility in Kansas City for processing. It was a massive facility that processed the effects of every soldier killed in action during that war. And they're going through every effect, you know, taking out anything you might not want your next of kin to have. Cleaning off any kind of evidence of blood and you know, of physical challenges that may have occurred, and sending those personal effects home to the next of kin. And then in 1947, the U.S. Army decided to repatriate those bodies whose families wanted their loved ones home. And so thus began another process where every body that the next of kin had requested was disinterred from their cemeteries. In Pete's case, it was Henri Chapelle in Belgium. Disinterred, carefully wrapped, put in a brand new coffin lined with rayon satin, sent to Antwerp. And in Pete's case, he was on the very first ship of American soldiers and servicemen and women who were returned home. There were 6,000 bodies that were put on the Joseph Connolly, a Liberty ship, and sailed out of Antwerp. And it was bedecked with flowers. It was freshly painted. Its manifest had the names of every person on the ship, whether or not he was alive or dead in U.S. Army tradition. And beside every name, including Pete, who was deceased, it said just that word, deceased. This sad ship, a ghost ship it was called, of 6,000 men who were brought home, arrived in New York Harbor one day in the fall of 1947. And it was met by the USS Missouri, who was firing a cannon. Its sounds echoing off the towers in New York. Other ships that were there to salute it, sailors lining the rails to welcome these soldiers home from where they would be divided up and sent back to their own homes. Pete's body would arrive back in the Charlotte Depot just outside of Kings Mountain on November 2nd, 1947, 3 years to the day of his death in the Hurtgen Forest. Mm-hmm. It was a process, and a sad one.
And a process that took him from Kings Mountain all the way back
It did.
to Kings Mountain.
It did.
So for you folks at home, like I said, I can't tell you enough about this, recommend this war story enough. It's not a military history. It's a war story. And it tells us about the story of a soldier, the world he lives in, his family, the home front, and all the details that have almost always been left out of everything else. So, and the writing is clear and concise and entertaining, and I thank you for that. It makes for a great read.
Thank you.
Not just a fascinating topic, but a great read. And so congratulations, Chris.
Thank you, Bjorn.
And so for you folks at home, let me tell you about some of the upcoming programs on Author's Voice, connecting authors to the world. In our new 2019 season, the debut episode of Solved, Brian Grewley joins Libby on January 18th, that's tomorrow, at noon Central Time, and they will discuss Bleak Harbor. Lit with Love, Sonali Dev's romance program, returns with Tracy Brogan to discuss My Kind of Forever. So ask a question. You can still ask questions afterwards. We might be able to get some answers to you using Facebook or something. Order a signed book at authorsvoice.net. We will still have signed copies of the book after this is over. If you're watching, like I said, if you're watching this program on YouTube, then there will be a link underneath the video, and you can click through there to our website and still be able to order a signed copy of The Lost Soldier. So thank you again for coming to Author's Voice. Thank you, Chris.
Thank you.
Thank you to the folks at home, and have a great day.